The first gunshot was a sharp, angry crack that split the noon air of Redemption Gulch. Elias Boone, his hand halfway to a sack of flour in the general store, froze. It was the sound of trouble, and for the past 5 years, trouble was something he had ridden a long way to avoid. A second shot followed closer this time, and then a woman's scream. Dust and chaos erupted on the town's only street. Elias moved to the doorway, his instincts honed by years of war, whispering warnings in his ear. Outside, 4 men on horseback held the street, their rifles leveled, their faces obscured by bandanas. 2 more were storming the Redemption Savings and Trust, their boots kicking up clouds of red dust. It was a bank robbery, brazen daylight and executed with military precision. Elias's hand drifted instinctively toward the revolver, holstered at his hip, a relic he carried more out of habit than intention. He was just here for coffee flour and salt. This was not his fight. He began to step back into the shadows of the store when the leader of the riders, a man impeccably dressed in a black frock coat and a silver bowler hat, turned his head. His bandana was down, revealing a clean-shaven, handsome face, with eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He wasn't looking at the bank. He was looking directly at Elias. A cold knot tightened in Elias's gut. The man dismounted with an easy grace, handing his reins to a subordinate. He walked across the street, his silver-headed cane tapping a steady, unhurried rhythm on the hard-packed earth. People scattered from his path, but Elias stood his ground in the doorway, a pillar of bewildered defiance. The man stopped a few feet away, a faint, predatory smile playing on his lips. His name, Elias would soon learn, was Silas Kane. Elias Boone Kane said, his voice calm and cultured, a stark contrast to the unfolding violence. "I was hoping I'd find you in town today. Saves me a ride out to that lonely little patch of dirt you call home." Elias's mind raced. He didn't know this man. He'd never seen him before in his life. "You have me at a disadvantage," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Kane's smile widened. "Oh, I think not. I believe you're holding something of mine, or rather, something I've decided I want." Before Elias could react, Kane moved with a speed that belied his refined appearance. He sidestepped his left hand, shooting out to grip Elias's wrist, while his right dipped into the breast pocket of Elias's worn coat. His fingers closed around the cool, familiar shape of the silver locket. He pulled it free. It swung from its delicate chain, glinting in the harsh sunlight. The world seemed to fall away for Elias. That locket was all he had left. Inside, behind the polished silver, was a miniature, hand-painted portrait of his wife, Sarah, her smile as bright and warm as the day he had last seen it. It was his anchor, his penance, his last connection to a life the world had stolen from him. "What are you doing?" Elias's voice was dangerously low, a dormant volcano rumbling to life. "An exchange," Kane said smoothly, snapping the locket shut and slipping it into his own waistcoat pocket. "A memory for a memory. You see, Mr. Boone, you and I have some unfinished business." Just then, the 2 men from the bank emerged, carrying not bags of money, but a single, heavy iron safe deposit box. They heaved it onto the back of a pack mule. Kane gave a curt nod. His objective was complete. The robbery had been a performance, a distraction for this one specific theft. Why, Elias demanded, his body rigid with a fury he hadn't felt in years. "Who are you?" Kane simply tapped his silver-headed cane against his boot. "You'll know soon enough. I've taken your past, Mr. Boone. If you want it back, you'll have to come and find me. But I warn you, the land I'm heading to has ghosts, and they remember you." With that, Silas Kane turned, mounted his horse, and spurred it into a gallop. His men followed their hoofbeats thundering out of town, leaving behind a terrified populace, a looted bank, and Elias Boone standing alone in the doorway, his hand clutching an empty pocket where his heart used to be. The mystery was a brand seared into his soul. Why him, and why, of all things, the locket? The ride back to his cabin was a journey through a purgatory of his own making. The scorched red earth of the territory bled into a bruised purple sky, a landscape as raw and wounded as his own spirit. Every gust of wind through the skeletal cottonwoods seemed to whisper Sarah's name, a sound that now carried the sharp edge of violation. The locket was gone. It was a simple object, a piece of silver and paint. But Cain had understood its power. He hadn't just stolen a memento. He had stolen the last tangible piece of a life that Elias had failed to protect. His cabin, when he reached it, offered no comfort. He had built it with his own hands 5 years ago, a one-room fortress against the world, and the memories that stalked him in the quiet hours. But now the silence within its walls was different. It was no longer a peaceful emptiness. It was a hollow, mocking void. He unslung his rifle, the weight, familiar but insufficient. He lit a lantern, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on his eyes. He saw her everywhere. He saw the empty space by the hearth where Sarah used to sit, her hands busy with mending her soft, humming, a gentle counterpoint to the crackling fire. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn table, remembering the day he had built it, and the small hands of his son Daniel helping him by hammering a nail crookedly into the leg. The nail was still there, a small bent testament to a future that had never arrived. Fever had taken them both in the same cruel winter, while he was miles away scouting for the Union, fighting a war that had promised to save the nation, but had only shattered his world. That night, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. He wasn't in his cabin. He was back at Black Creek, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Rain fell in cold, relentless sheets, turning the ground to mud. Men were screaming. He saw their faces, young and terrified, looking to him for orders. He was a scout, a lieutenant. His job was to see the path to lead them to safety. But the ambush had been perfect. They were pinned down, encircled, dying one by one. And through the chaos, he heard the voice of his captain, Captain Daniel Cain, crying out. His legs shattered, his face a mask of agony. "Don't leave me, Boone. Don't leave me." But the path to safety was a retreat. To stay was to die. To save the rest of his men, he had to leave one behind. He gave the order. Fall back now. He remembered the look in the captain's eyes, a flash of betrayal that had burned itself into his memory. Elias awoke with a gasp, his body slick with sweat, the phantom scream still ringing in his ears. He sat up, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The name. Cain. The man in town, Silas Cain. The connection was a bolt of lightning in the dark, a terrifying, impossible coincidence. He stumbled to the small wash basin, splashing cold water on his face, trying to scrub away the ghost of a decision made a decade ago. It couldn't be. But the calculated nature of the attack, the theft of the locket, the chilling words. The land I'm heading to has ghosts, and they remember you. It all pointed to a truth he wasn't ready to face. His past wasn't just haunting him in his sleep anymore. It had ridden into town on a fine horse, and it had a name. The following day, Elias moved with a grim purpose, his grief curdling into a slow-burning rage. He rode his property line, checking fences that no longer felt like a boundary, but a cage. His mission was no longer just survival. It was retrieval. He had to get the locket back. It was a foolish, sentimental quest, but it was the only thing that mattered. As the sun began its descent, casting long golden fingers across the valley, He headed down to the river to fetch water, his mind a maelstrom of old guilt and new fury. That was when he saw her. A shape crumpled among the rocks and driftwood downstream, a smear of color where only gray stone should be. He approached cautiously, rifle ready, the unease of the last 24 hours sharpening his senses. It was a woman, young Apache, her deerskin dress torn and stained with mud and blood. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, hitching breaths. He could have walked away. It would have been the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. Bringing an Apache woman into his home was an invitation for a different kind of trouble. But as he looked down at her pale, unconscious face, he saw not a stranger, but another life poised on the brink of being extinguished. He had left one person to die a lifetime ago. He couldn't do it again. He knelt, lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than she should be, and carried her back to the cabin. As he laid her on his bed, and the only soft place in the entire structure, he had no idea that he was not just saving a life, but bringing the answer to his own burning questions directly into the heart of his sanctuary. He worked through the night, his hands calloused from labor, moving with the surprising gentleness of a man who remembered how to care for the fragile. He cleaned her wounds, splinted her broken ankle with slats of kindling, and forced warm broth between her lips. She remained unconscious, a silent guest in a house that had forgotten the sound of another's breathing. It wasn't until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window that her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep-set, and filled with a wary intelligence. She stared at him, taking in his tired face, the rifle leaning by the door, the unfamiliar ceiling above her. Elias sat on a crate beside the bed, a tin cup of water in his hand. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Her own voice was a dry whisper, but the words were clear, and they struck Elias like a physical blow. "The same men who stole from you in town," she said, her gaze unwavering. The man with a silver-headed cane. The two separate calamities of his life, the theft of his past and the arrival of this wounded stranger, were not separate at all. They were two threads of the same rope, and it was tightening around his neck. Elias was no longer just helping a stranger. He was sheltering an enemy of his enemy. He offered her the cup of water, and as her fingers brushed against his, a tense, unspoken alliance was forged in the quiet cabin. Her name, she told him, was Sonia, and she had been fleeing Silas Kane's men when they ran her down by the river. Her tribe, led by her father, Chief Dakota, lived on the ancestral lands to the north, the very same lands that bordered the haunted ground of Black Creek. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that was darker and more personal than Elias could have ever imagined. The next 2 days were a blur of tense quiet and shared purpose. Elias tended to Sana's injuries, and she in turn began to fill the silence with fragments of her story. Silas Kane had appeared a few months prior, a wealthy and charming businessman, with an offer to buy the tribe's land. When Chief Dakota refused, Kane's methods turned sinister. He had his men disrupt their water supply, spook their game, and harass their hunting parties. He was trying to starve them out, to force them off the land he so desperately craved. "But it is not just land he wants," Sana said one evening, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames in the stove. "He searches for something. He has his men digging near the old collapsed mine at Black Creek. He is obsessed with that place." Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. "He's looking for graves." Sana nodded. "He wants the bones of the soldiers who died there." On the third day, the trouble they had been waiting for arrived. It came not with a knock, but with the sudden whooshing roar of fire. Elias looked up from the table to see orange light dancing outside the window. The entire front porch was ablaze. He grabbed his rifle as 3 of Kane's men charged from the tree line, their guns firing. "They want to burn us out," Elias yelled, shoving the heavy table against the door. "Stay down." Sana, despite her splinted leg, crawled to the far corner, the bone-handled knife he'd given her clutched in her hand. This was not a conversation. It was an execution. The heat was becoming unbearable smoke, pouring through the gaps in the log walls. Elias kicked open the small rear shutter, a narrow opening he used for ventilation. It was their only way out. "We have to move," he said, his voice tight. "Through the back into the woods. I'll cover you." He fired 2 shots through the main window, forcing the attackers to take cover. The sound of shattering glass was followed by a volley of return fire bullets, thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin. Under the cover of the noise, Elias helped Sana through the rear window. Her face was grim with pain, but she made no sound. Once she was clear, he climbed out after her, the rifle hot in his hands. They scrambled into the dense woods behind the cabin, the sounds of the crackling fire and the men's angry shouts pursuing them. Elias knew this land like the back of his own scarred hand. He was a scout. This was his element. He led Sana through a winding game trail, his movements silent and sure, putting distance between them and their hunters. After a few hundred yards, he found a rocky outcropping that gave them a defensible position with a clear view of the cabin. "They'll come looking," Sana whispered, her breathing ragged. "Let them," Elias grunted, reloading his rifle. One of the men, a big bearded brute, grew impatient and broke from the others, charging into the woods. It was a foolish mistake. Elias waited, his breathing slow and steady, the world narrowing to the space between his rifle's sight and the man's chest. He squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the valley, and the man fell without a sound. The other 2, seeing their companion drop, became more cautious. They exchanged fire with Elias for another 10 minutes, their shots wild and panicked, before realizing they had lost the advantage. With a final curse, they retreated, dragging their fallen comrade with them. In the ensuing silence, the only sound was the hiss and pop of the burning cabin. The porch was gone, the front wall blackened and charred, but the main structure, built of thick green timber, had held. Elias and Sana watched the smoke curl into the afternoon sky. Their home, their sanctuary, was scarred but not destroyed. As Elias scanned the area where the men had been, his eyes caught a glint of brass in the dirt. He moved down cautiously and picked it up. It was a button, heavy and ornate, with a faded eagle insignia. A Union officer's coat button. It was identical to the ones on the uniform Captain Daniel Kane had been wearing the day he died. The flicker of recognition ignited into certainty. This wasn't just about land or revenge. It was a morbid pilgrimage. "He knows," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "He knows I was there." The attack had failed, but it had succeeded in its own way. It had stripped away any lingering doubt and solidified the bond between Elias and Sana. They were no longer just a man and a woman caught in the same storm. They were partners in a war against a ghost. And Elias knew he could no longer wait for the fight to come to him. He had to ride back to Redemption Gulch, back into the lion's den, and find out exactly who Silas Kane was and what demons he was trying to dig up at Black Creek. Driven by the chilling discovery of the officer's button, Elias knew he had to act. Leaving Sana to rest and keep watch over the damaged cabin, he saddled his horse and rode for Redemption Gulch under the cover of a moonless night. He was no longer a man hiding from the world. He was an investigator, a hunter, moving back into the territory he had long since abandoned. He avoided the main street, tethering his horse in a copse of trees behind the town's dilapidated livery stable. He moved through the shadows, a ghost in his own right, his old scout skills serving him well. His destination was the office of Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary posture and perpetually tired eyes spoke of a long, thankless career trying to keep the peace on the edge of civilization. Elias found him nursing a cup of coffee in his small, cluttered office. The sheriff looked up, his expression shifting from boredom to surprise. Boone. Didn't figure you for a night owl. What trouble brings you sniffing around my door after dark? Silas Kane. Elias said, getting straight to the point. He placed the brass button on the sheriff's desk. One of his men dropped this while trying to burn down my cabin last night. Brody picked up the button, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the insignia. Union officer's issue. Old. He sighed, running a hand over his balding head. Kane. Man rode into town a few months back with more money than sense and a charter from the railroad. Bought up the old Miller claim and started hiring every gun for hire between here and the territories. Says he's prospecting for silver. He's not, Elias stated flatly. He's digging for something else at the old Black Creek mine. He's been asking questions around town, hasn't he? The sheriff leaned back his chair, groaning in protest. He has. Been real interested in the town's history. Specifically the war. More specifically, a little skirmish they called the Black Creek ambush. Been asking if there were any survivors from the Union patrol that got hit there. Paying good money for stories. The air in the small office grew thick. Elias felt the walls closing in. Did you tell him anything? I told him what I know, which ain't much. Brody set his gaze steady. That a whole patrol was wiped out. That the Army report was sealed. That folks around here say the place is haunted by soldier boys who never got a proper burial. Never mentioned any names because I never knew any. Until now, I suppose. He gestured toward Elias. You were there, weren't you, Boone? You were one of them. Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth was written all over his face. Look, Brody said, his voice lowering. Kane is powerful. He's got the railroad in his pocket and half the town on his payroll. Whatever fight you have with him, you'll be fighting it alone. I can't touch him. Not officially. He slid the button back across the desk. But if a man were to say find himself in a tight spot, he might also find that the sheriff's attention is conveniently directed elsewhere for a time. That's the best I can do for you. Elias took the button, the cold metal a weight in his palm. It was all the help he was going to get. He thanked the sheriff and slipped back out into the night, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into a terrifying whole. Kane wasn't just interested in the ambush. He was hunting for the story of his brother's last moments, and he was hunting for the man he held responsible. He returned to the cabin before dawn to find Sana awake waiting for him. He told her everything: the sheriff's confirmation, Kane's obsession with the ambush, the certainty that this was a personal vendetta. Sana listened, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she spoke with a quiet intensity. My people have known for generations that the ground at Black Creek is sacred. Not because of your war, but because of what is buried beneath it. It is the heart of our ancestral lands. The spirits of our ancestors sleep there. If Kane disturbs that ground, he is not just desecrating the graves of his soldiers. He is declaring war on my people. The stakes had been raised once more. This was no longer just Elias's fight or a simple land dispute. It was a collision of histories, a battle over sacred ground, soaked in the blood of two different wars. Elias knew a confrontation was inevitable, but he never imagined Kane would be the one to orchestrate it. 2 days later, one of Kane's men rode up to the cabin unarmed and carrying a white flag. He delivered a simple message: Silas Kane requested a meeting with Elias Boone. That evening, at the Redemption Saloon. Alone. It was a trap, plain and simple, but it was also an invitation Elias couldn't refuse. To end this, he had to face the ghost he had been running from for 10 years. The Redemption Saloon was quiet when Elias pushed through the swinging doors. The usual din of piano music and drunken laughter was absent. The few patrons present nursed their drinks in silence, their eyes darting nervously between him and the man waiting for him at a back table. Silas Kane sat alone, a bottle of whiskey and 2 clean glasses before him. He was dressed as always in his immaculate black coat, the silver head of his cane resting against the table. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Mr. Boone," Kane said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for coming. I was beginning to think you were a man who preferred to solve his problems from the shadows." Elias sat down, but didn't touch the glass Kane pushed toward him. "I'm here. State your business." "My business." Kane chuckled, pouring himself a drink. "My business is memory. Its legacy, its honor. Concepts you might find unfamiliar." He took a slow sip of whiskey. "I've been doing some research on you, Elias. Former Union scout, decorated for bravery, a man who always brought his men back. Well, almost always." The air crackled with unspoken history. Elias's hands rested on the table, his knuckles white. "Let's stop playing games," Kane said, his voice losing its charming veneer and taking on a sharp, cold edge. "Let's talk about the Black Creek ambush. Let's talk about the day you left my brother, Captain Daniel Kane, to die in the mud." The name spoken aloud confirmed everything. Elias felt a cold dread wash over him, a guilt he had carried for a decade, rising to the surface. "It was a tactical retreat," he said, his voice hoarse. "To stay would have been suicide for the entire patrol." A tactical retreat. Kane sneered, his mask of civility finally shattering. "You call abandoning your commanding officer, my brother, a tactic? He looked up to you, Boone. He wrote about you in his letters home. He said you were the finest scout in the regiment. He trusted you. And you left him to be captured, tortured, and killed." Kane leaned forward, his gray eyes burning with a righteous fire. "Our family was ruined after his death. My father lost his will to live. Our name, once respected, became a whisper of disgrace. All because of your cowardice. The land I am claiming, the land your Apache whores tribe squats on, is the exact spot where my brother drew his last breath. I'm not digging for silver, Boone. I'm building a monument, a memorial to a hero you abandoned. And I will wipe every trace of your existence from that valley to do it." Then, in a final devastating gesture, he reached into his waistcoat and produced the silver locket. He flicked it open with his thumb. The face of Sarah, smiling and full of life, stared up from within. "A life for a life," Kane whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "You watched my family die. Now I'll watch yours burn." The threat was no longer about land or money or even a monument. It was a promise of total annihilation. The conflict had been stripped bare, revealing the raw personal hatred at its core. This was a war not over territory, but over the past, and only one of them would be left standing to write its history. The confrontation in the saloon changed everything. Kane's war was now out in the open, and he moved swiftly to turn it against Elias. Within a day, the whispers started. Elias Boone, the reclusive widower, was now Elias Boone, the rustler. Old Man Hemlock's prize bull went missing, and its tracks were found leading conveniently toward Elias's property. Then the town's well turned brackish, and rumors spread that Boone, in league with the hostile natives he was sheltering, had poisoned it. It was a campaign of lies, masterfully orchestrated by Kane, who played the part of the concerned citizen, offering rewards for information and funding the posse that Sheriff Brody was reluctantly forced to assemble. Elias was no longer a person. He was a scapegoat, a target for the town's fear and frustration. He became a hunted man. "We can't stay here." Sana set her face grim as they watched the distant lights of the posse's torches weaving through the valley below. They will not stop. She was right. The cabin was no longer a fortress. It was a trap. They packed what little they could, a bedroll dried meat ammunition, and the land deed that now felt like a bitter joke. As they fled into the wilderness, the last embers of the life Elias had built winked out behind them. They were fugitives, with only the harsh, unforgiving landscape as their ally. But in that shared hardship, something shifted between them. They were no longer just allies. They were partners moving as one. His tracking skills and her deep knowledge of the land became their lifeline. She showed him which routes were safe to eat, how to find water in dry creek beds, and which caves offered the best shelter from the biting wind. He taught her how to reload his rifle in the dark, how to read the tracks of shod horses, and how to set a perimeter of silent alarms using nothing but tripwires and pebbles in a tin can. Their nights were spent huddled close for warmth by small smokeless fires, the vast canopy of stars, their only roof. The enforced intimacy broke down the last of their reservations. The silence between them became less about caution and more about a deep, comfortable understanding. One night, sitting beneath the silhouette of a towering mesa, Elias finally spoke of the burden he had carried for so long. He told Sana the full story of the Black Creek ambush. He spared no detail recounting the driving rain, the chaos, the screams of the wounded, and the terrible choice he had made. He was right. Elias confessed, his voice heavy with the weight of a decade of guilt. I left him. I told myself it was to save the others, and it was. But that doesn't change the fact that I abandoned a man who trusted me. I've seen his face in my dreams every night since. Sana listened without judgment. When he was finished, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was firm grounding. You made a choice between two deaths, she said softly. You chose the one that saved the most lives. A leader carries the weight of such choices. My father has made them. It is the burden of command, not the mark of a coward. Her words didn't absolve him, but they offered something he hadn't realized. He needed perspective. She didn't forgive him. She understood him. In that moment of shared vulnerability, their bond deepened into something stronger than alliance, more profound than partnership. It was a quiet, unspoken love, forged in fire and flight. They spent weeks on the run, always moving, always watching. But they both knew they couldn't run forever. The final confrontation was looming, and it would not happen in a town or at a cabin. It would happen where it all began, at Black Creek. Using her knowledge of the terrain, Sana led them on a secret path to her people's winter camp, a hidden canyon unknown to any white man. There they met with Chief Dakota. He stood before his warriors, his face a mask of stoic resolve. Elias stood beside Sana, no longer an outsider, but a trusted ally. He explained Cain's true motives, his plan to desecrate their sacred land, to build a monument to his own hatred. Dakota listened, his dark eyes fixed on Elias. This man Cain seeks to wake the spirits of the dead. The chief said, his voice resonating with ancient authority. He does not understand that some spirits should be left to sleep. My warriors will ride with you, Elias Boone. We will defend our land. We will defend our ancestors. The final battle was set. It would be a three-way conflict, Cain and his mercenaries driven by vengeance, Dakota and his warriors fighting to protect their heritage, and Elias and Sana fighting for a future they had only just begun to believe was possible. They would make their stand at the abandoned mining complex at Black Creek, a place of ghosts where the past was about to violently collide with the present. The sky over Black Creek was the color of a fresh bruise. A storm was rolling in from the north, its dark belly rumbling with distant thunder. Wind whipped through the skeletal remains of the old mining complex, moaning through the rotten timbers and rickety headframes. It was here at the epicenter of his guilt that Elias Boone would make his final stand. He and Sana stood with Dakota and 20 of his best warriors concealed among the rocks overlooking the mine. Below, Silas Kane and his dozen hired guns were already at work, and their shovels biting into the sacred earth near the collapsed main shaft. They were not prospecting. They were excavating, turning the site of a forgotten battle into a desecrated graveyard. As the first drops of cold rain began to fall, Dakota gave a sharp bird-like call. It was the signal. His warriors descended from the rocks like ghosts' arrows flying from their bows with deadly precision. 2 of Kane's men fell before they even knew they were under attack. The air exploded into a chaotic symphony of gunfire, war cries, and the rising howl of the storm. Elias and Sana moved as one, using the decaying structures of the mine for cover. He was a scout, a tactician, and this was his battlefield. He directed Dakota's men using hand signals to orchestrate flanking maneuvers, turning Kane's superior firepower into a liability in the close-quarters chaos of the collapsing buildings. The fight was brutal and desperate. The thunderstorm broke with full fury, rain lashing down in blinding sheets, lightning illuminating the violent tableau in stark, terrifying flashes. Elias found himself face to face with Kane inside the dilapidated ore processing shed. The 2 men circled each other, rain pouring through the shattered roof, their faces lit by the strobing flashes of lightning. "This ends now." Boone Kane roared over the thunder, his fine clothes soaked and splattered with mud. He lunged not with a gun, but with a heavy mining pick, swinging it with a maniacal strength. Elias dodged the pickaxe, embedding itself in a wooden support beam. He tackled Kane, and the 2 men crashed to the floor, trading desperate, visceral blows. This was not a gunfight. It was a brawl fueled by a decade of hatred and guilt. "My brother trusted you," Kane screamed, landing a solid punch to Elias's jaw. "I did what I had to do." Elias grunted back, wrestling Kane for control. As they struggled, a lightning strike hit the nearby headframe, which buckled with a groan of tortured metal and wood. The shed around them began to collapse. A heavy beam fell, pinning Kane's leg to the ground. He cried out in agony, his face a mask of pain and fury. Elias stood over him, his revolver aimed at Kane's head. This was it, the moment to end it all. But as he looked down at his defeated enemy, he saw not a monster, but a man broken by grief. "He didn't die in the ambush," Kane gasped, his voice choked with rain and pain. The sudden confession stopped Elias cold. "That was the lie the army told us. He survived. He was captured." But when the prisoner exchange came months later, the Union Army, they left him off the list. Said an officer who allowed himself to be captured was a disgrace. They abandoned him, Boone. He died months later in a prison camp alone and disgraced. The ultimate betrayal wasn't from you. It was from the very institution you served. The secondary twist hit Elias harder than any punch. It didn't absolve him of his choice, but it reframed his guilt, placing it within a larger, more cynical context of institutional betrayal. His enemy was not just this man, but the entire brutal system of war that had chewed them both up and spit them out. Killing Kane now felt meaningless, an act of vengeance that would solve nothing. He lowered his gun. Just then, Chief Dakota and 2 of his warriors entered the collapsing shed. Their faces were grim, their purpose clear. "This man desecrated our land." Dakota said, his voice low and final. "His justice belongs to us now." Elias nodded. He backed away, leaving the wounded, hate-filled Silas Cain to the judgment of the people whose sacred ground he had violated. As Elias and Sana emerged from the wreckage of the mine, the storm began to break. The rain softened, and a sliver of pale light appeared on the horizon. The battle was over. In the quiet calm after the storm, Elias stood with Chief Dakota on a ridge overlooking the valley. The air was clean washed by the rain. Below, Dakota's warriors were rounding up the last of Cain's defeated men. The fate of Silas Cain would be decided by tribal law, a justice far more ancient and fitting than any Elias could have delivered. Dakota turned to him, his gaze deep and assessing. "You fought with the heart of a warrior and the mind of a chief," he said, a note of profound respect in his voice. "You have honored my daughter. You have defended our land. Our fight with you is over." He extended a hand, not in the white man's way, but palm up an offering. "There is peace between my people and your house." Elias met the gesture, a pact sealed without paper or ink. Dakota made it clear that Sana's future was her own to decide, but the blessing was implicit. The land was safe. The journey back to their cabin was slow and somber. The structure stood scarred and blackened, a testament to the violence it had endured. The front porch was gone, the door was a charred ruin, and the front wall was pockmarked with bullet holes. It was a wreck. But as they stood before it, surveying the damage, they felt not despair, but a sense of a clean slate. Without a word, they began to work. He started by clearing the debris, his movement strong and steady. She went inside, sweeping away the soot and ash, her actions careful and deliberate. They worked together, the shared simple tasks of cleaning and mending, becoming a ritual, a silent promise to build a new life from the ashes of the old. They weren't just rebuilding a cabin. They were building a home together. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet rhythm of their shared labor, a hopeful sound in the vast, peaceful valley. Weeks later, a new rhythm had settled over the valley. The spring thaw was complete, and the land was bursting with new life, stubbornly erasing the scars of the recent conflict. The town of Redemption Gulch, having learned the truth about Cain from a tight-lipped Sheriff Brody, had decided that leaving Elias Boone in peace was the wisest course of action. The posse had been disbanded with muttered apologies, and the stolen bull had mysteriously found its way back to Hemlock's pasture. Life in the rebuilt cabin was quiet but full. Elias and Sana had repaired the damage, and the new porch built from fresh-cut pine smelled sweet in the morning air. Their days were filled with the simple grounding work of existence, planting a small garden, tending the cattle, and sharing meals at the rough-hewn table. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and rose, Elias took the silver locket from his pocket. Cain's men, upon their capture, had surrendered it to Dakota, who had returned it to Elias without a word. He opened it, his thumb tracing the delicate rim of the portrait within. He looked at Sarah's smiling face, a face he had loved with all the fierce, naive passion of his youth. He felt not the sharp sting of fresh grief, but a gentle, bittersweet ache of a love that had run its course. It was a part of his story, a beautiful, tragic chapter, but it was not the whole book. He walked with Sana to a quiet bluff overlooking the valley, the locket held gently in his palm. He didn't throw it into the canyon. That would have felt like a betrayal, an erasure. Instead, he knelt, and with his hands dug a small hole in the soft earth at the base of a newly planted sapling, a young cottonwood that would one day grow tall and strong. He placed the locket inside a final precious offering to the land. As he covered it with soil, he knew he wasn't burying his past, but allowing it to become the foundation for new growth. He stood and turned to Sana. For the first time in as long as he could remember, his expression was one of complete and utter peace. The ghosts of Black Creek were finally silent. Sana smiled a small knowing smile that reached her eyes. "I have something for you as well," she said. She led him back to the cabin. The charred ruin of the old door had been removed. In its place, leaning against the wall, was a new one she had been working on in secret. It was carved from a single solid plank of cedar. Near the top, she had meticulously etched two symbols side by side. On the left was a simple stylized B, the initial of his family. On the right was the crescent mark of her tribe. They were not two separate marks, but two halves of a single design intertwined. They were a new clan, a new family born not of blood, but of choice and survival. He reached out and ran his fingers over the carving, the smooth wood warm beneath his touch. He looked from the door to her face, his heart full of a quiet, powerful emotion for which he had no words. She simply took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. Together they stood in the doorway of their home, looking out at their shared land, no longer haunted by the past, but facing a future they would build together.